event, When the Door Closes, Rethinking Human Rights Impact in Eurasia, is a co-sponsored effort between the Harriman Institute and Human Rights Watch. And the occasion to come together is to think analytically about some of the amazing work that our mutual colleague, Rachel Denber, has overseen and really been a driving force in the human rights space. And so we don't want to just reflect on the past. We want to do something that's actually quite contemporary and a pressing challenge that we see closing spaces everywhere, not just in Eurasia. And so we have some leading experts with us today to help think through both the analytical side and the advocacy side. And so we're really grateful. I'm not going to go into their full bios. I'll just introduce them by name when it's their turn to speak. We're going to forego the normal kind of panel and just go kind of consecutively here. Towards the end, we'll have about 20 minutes for questions. We'll throw it up. We'll open it up rather for your questions here and online. But with some words of welcome, I want to pass the floor to Jack Snyder, my poli-sci colleague at Columbia, also acting director of the Harriman, and also very interested in human rights and pragmatic strategies of human rights for some words of welcome and introductory thoughts. Jack.
Thanks, Alex. I'm very interested in the topic of our discussion today, and can't wait to see what we learned from 2 hours of intense discussion of this. We have two purposes today. One of them is to recognize Rachel Denber for her energetic expert service to our fields of human rights and whatever we call that former Soviet space. I like to just think of it as the Harriman region.
Yes.
And as you know, Rachel has had high office at Human Rights Watch, the former deputy director of the Eurasia and Central Asia division there, and over the course of a long career, had many accomplishments and many impacts along the way. Impact is the key word for our discussion today. Human rights activists are supposed to have a theory of change. Rachel had theories of change and implemented them. But now we are in a new ballgame with new constraints, new forces at work. And what we want to talk about today is how, under these changed circumstances, we can still have impact that's positive for human rights in the region. This may require us to rethink the definition of impact. What does that mean under these adverse circumstances, where we need to do research and documentation of abuses, but where research and advocacy organizations have been banned or exiled? That's all I want to say, and I think this is just such an important subject, and we have amazing experts who have, thought big about this, but also completely been in the trenches for a number of years. So we have the right people in the room to make headway today.
Great, and just a reminder, this is a hybrid event. It's being live streamed, and also many colleagues and friends are joining us from Berlin, as well as other places. And I just want to give the floor virtually to Hugh Williamson, who's the director of the Europe and Central Asia division at Human Rights Watch, to also say a few words of welcome. Hugh, welcome.
Thank you so much, Alex. It's lovely to see you. It's lovely to see everybody. Sorry I can't be there in person, but it's great to be part of this event. And thank you so much to Jack and Alex for for hosting this and hosting it and being a partner in this event for us. And it's lovely to see you, of course, Rachel, as well. And I think there were some other Human Rights Watch staff in the meeting. I think I can't see anybody, but I think there were some other colleagues there, and there are many online as well. As you say, Alex, the motivation for organizing this event was at Rachel's transition to leaving Human Rights Watch in the summer, and we thought it was appropriate and right to sort of to have an event which focuses on the challenges, some of the challenges in the Eurasia region in the future, and in a sense drawing on and appreciating all the expertise that Rachel's brought to this topic over the last 34 years that she worked for Human Rights Watch. Huh? And I thought I'd use my time, my 5 minutes, just to speak a tiny bit about that work, a little bit looking back, as you mentioned, Alex, but to sort of to reflect on it. Obviously, Rachel brought many qualities to Human Rights Watch, and just to sort of, you know, I'm the lucky one on the panel, as it were, who actually worked with her. I worked with Rachel for the last 14 years. I joined Human Rights Watch in 2011. And it was a pleasure to work with her as a great leader and mentor and supervisor, and in management and leadership capacities. But obviously, I also benefited hugely from your expertise in the region, Rachel. And but we're here today to focus on that expertise and what you brought to sort of intellectual development and thinking on how to improve human rights in the Eurasia region as a whole. I thought I'd focus on just briefly on a couple of aspects. You're probably, I don't know, you may well be the only person in this room who's worked on or maybe even been in every single country in Eurasia region. I mean, we're talking Russia, Belarus, we're talking all 5 Central Asian countries, South Caucasus. Pardon, Rachel?
Well, trivia quiz, which one did I never go to? No, I
Maybe
think
Moldova?
What?
Moldova?
That was going to be my second.
Moldova. I
Easily
was going to
correct.
say Moldova's probably the country you've
You
not been
can
to
go to.
and you've worked on least, but you know, but nevertheless, you've worked on in all 5 Central Asian countries, South Caucasus, Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, of course. Huh? But and that's impressive enough. But I was also thinking just quickly, you know, there's been so many variations on the theme over these 35 years since the fall of the Soviet Union on how to tackle, you know, how to bring about human rights improvements in so many different variations of essentially authoritarian governments. And you've worked on all of them, Rachel. I mean, if I just list them very briefly, we had countries in transition after the fall of the Soviet Union, like Russia itself. We had countries that quickly turned towards authoritarianism, like the Central Asian states in the 90s. We had sort of chaotic democracies, Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, Georgia, until recently, perhaps. In that category, we had countries that were closed very quickly and not have access to human rights activists, such as Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, now, of course, Russia and Belarus. And we've had countries at war, you know, or regions at war, North Caucasus, Nagorno-Karabakh, Georgia, and of course, Ukraine now. And you've led work, you've thought about how we can tackle human rights abuses in these regions through all these different lenses and contexts. And that's really impressive. And that's why I think it's worth holding this event to look at this particular angle about how to have impact, but to draw on your expertise that you bring from all those different variations on tackling authoritarianism in one way or another. So I'll finish there, and I look forward to the conversation, look forward to joining in as well, and pass it back to the panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Let's now move to our first guest and panelist, Tatyana Margolin, now of the organization STROIKA. And I'll just mention by way of introduction, Tanya is really experienced exactly in this space, how to deal with closed societies. And in fact, STROIKA has become, I would say, one of the leaders in offering practical advice on all aspects of dealing with closed societies. So Tanya, thank you so much for being here. And we look forward to your diagnosis and then some of your words of wisdom.
Thank you very much. And Rachel, obviously incredible to be here to honor you, the trailblazer, and we have to get you in Moldova ASAP.
Yeah.
That's my takeaway already.
I'm ready,
Okay,
anytime.
we're gonna make it happen. So of course, when you are in a conversation like this, I mean, the mood cannot be bright, right? Things are bad, bleak. But I will start by saying that actually, since even my very first trip to Russia for my former job at Open Society, or my first engagement with Russian civil society, things were bad. We thought things were worse than they could have ever been. We thought it was really, awful. We were taking a lot of kind of precautions to how can we keep on doing this. And this is in 2009, which of course we now look at as the good old days. And so that really has stuck with me in terms of how I analyze current moment, which of course also seems, rock bottom, the barrel, bottom of the barrel. And yet we have to remember that we've been in that moment many times before, and it may not be the worst that we've yet seen. So I think, again, this is probably like a very Soviet comment, but it really grounds me often to think of, it really just doesn't seem like it can get worse, but we know that it can. At the same time, perhaps there can be also some, bright moments. Just to, as a way of introduction, my organization, STROIKA, we help a lot of US groups these days, actually, to learn from our experience in Eurasia. But in order to not just do kind of like very depressing things, we started a video podcast series called Precedented, because of course you hear this word that, the situation in America is so unprecedented. So we started this interview series with human rights activists and journalists from around the world on how they've lived through much worse moments and continued actually doing things through these worse moments. So I thought I might start with just some lessons from these interviews. And we interviewed many Russian journalists, actually, almost like half, I think, of the interviews so far in season 1 have been Russian journalists. And, that's a pretty cynical group. Of course, most are in exile. And exile is a theme I want to bookmark and return to. And some of the, key lessons that we heard from them is, one, the preparedness piece is one thing that they truly regret and wish they'd done earlier. And that's, I think, a good lesson for just kind of a remaining civil society, is that it's never too late to start preparing for things to get worse. And whether that means, setting up, organizations abroad, diversifying, what have you, like the level of unpreparedness they all experienced when they were pushed into exile is really something that still sits with them to this day, even though they've mostly settled and figured things out. But they really, because we asked them, if you knew then what you know now, everyone without fail said, I would have started my own YouTube channel then. I would have started, thinking about these things then. And this is definitely a lesson we try to bring to the US, that even if things turn out okay, no one has ever regretted being prepared. So everyone wishes that they started kind of like their own thing earlier than they did. One of the other things is, of course, changing the definition of success. And I think that kind of like tackles what we're here to talk about, impact. The big wins that, for example, when I was in philanthropy, we would want people to identify in their grant proposals, we're going to shift this, move that. Like, oftentimes these things are not realistic, not possible. And really, we need to be listening to folks on the ground as to what they think success is going to look like. And it may just be, quite incremental and not even feel like success to us from over here. But let's look at the, for example, current moment with the street buskers and street musicians being arrested for performing, songs by foreign agents and those in exile. Like, how do you kind of squeeze success out of this moment, right? Like, we still see protests, even in the most shut down society. There are still people willing to go in the street and take these risks. And there's still people willing to go out and defend those people who took these risks. So I would say that's impact, that's success. But of course, many of them might get real jail terms. Will any space open after this? That's very questionable. I think a lot of success these days is kind of like people not feeling alone, feeling that there are others who feel like they feel, because what authoritarians do is they make everyone feel very isolated. And of course, I don't need to tell you, Rachel, like, people are back in the proverbial kitchens. And I think for them to not feel as isolated and alone in those kitchens is already some sort of success. Also, in general, I think the relationship between exiles and folks on the ground is really critical right now. And I think we're seeing a bit of a duality. On the one hand, we see a lot of the, if you read about kind of the white emigres in the early 20th century and kind of how they were undermined, and how their relationship with those who stayed was undermined. A lot of the similar tactics are taking place right now, right? Particularly we see that with those who define themselves as opposition politicians. They're being challenged. There's a lot of infighting. So you can look at the exile scene that way and say, it's all just repeating itself and going nowhere. But I think at the same time, if you kind of flip the script and say, well, actually, we have these exile journalists who are putting out all of this information because they can still, they're in free countries, and they're figuring out all these ways to deliver this information to folks on the ground, right? Like breaking through VPN blocks, breaking through WhatsApp bans, Telegram bans, they're sitting there figuring out how to get this information to folks back in the country. I think there's a lot of appreciation actually bridging between those who stayed and those who left. So I think the government is pushing very hard to create a narrative of, those who left don't know what's going on here, they're traitors, etc. But I do think that the exile piece has been really critical to our current quote unquote impact. And I think not just in Russia, I would say that also in Belarus. And my kind of like last thing I would mention is, I think a lot of, and this is, I've done a lot of thinking about this as a former donor in terms of what it's like to, as a donor, quote unquote, build civil society versus how civil society can organically grow. And I think, in Kyrgyzstan, it's been most depressing to see how easy it's been to decimate a civil society that was so kind of artificially supported and funded and built. And this isn't to say that we shouldn't have done it, but I think we should have certainly considered investing more in things like community organizing and some grassroots initiatives, because I was recently doing a workshop for HIV/AIDS service providers from Kyrgyzstan, asking them, like, who are your allies? Who are the people, you've been doing this work for 25 years. Who is going to go out and say, they do amazing work? Or who is going to let you rent a room in their building when, you've been put on every list and no one wants to be your landlord? And they really didn't know. And that was really shocking, really sad, and really depressing. So that, again, I think it's not too late to learn this lesson. Like, there really has to be community buy-in into a lot of these high-level civil society interventions that we from this end do. And thankfully, I don't feel like that's been the case in Russia. Actually, I think that they did that better. But I do, unfortunately, I feel like a lot of the Central Asia piece, that's been our oversight. And again, even in places like Belarus, like Russia, just ones that things are so bleak, there are moments of kind of people pushing and people still striving for freedom. And I think at this point, we really have to derive as much hope and optimism from that as we can, because this is a tough moment, but it also may be soon enough something like right now, maybe the good old days. So, I mean, again, if you leave with something like this, like, we got to squeeze everything out of this moment and be prepared for it to potentially get worse.
Thank you, Tanya. And also thank you for this work that you're doing on the comparisons. And, for so long in both the academic and the policy space, we've thought of, us teaching them the sort of post-communist Harriman region, whatever it is, and how to do things. And this really is a time for reflection that we have a lot of lessons to learn, and as an academic community, right? And so the adversity that's been faced by many of our sort of peers overseas. Okay, let's move on. Our next commentator is Nate Schenkkan, who is also a Harriman grad affiliate. Also, he is the former vice president for research at Freedom House, someone who has, again, bridged this gap between research and analysis and advocacy in a very thoughtful way across the Harriman region. And lately has been at the forefront of thinking about this phenomenon called transnational repression. He has an excellent article in the Journal of Democracy on the golden era of transnational repression. So, Nate, that's a certain part of it, but I know you've thought a lot about advocacy and impact in closed societies. So, looking forward to your thoughts and comments.
Thanks. Yeah, and in the spirit of dialogue, I'll try to kind of just build on what Tanya's talking about and try to cohere into a view maybe from a different perspective, less bottom up and more top down. I mean, I think that the Eurasia situation, I don't have a lot to add to what's already been said, that it's as bad as it's ever been. It's certainly the worst it's ever been in my career. You think about the map with Kyrgyzstan and Georgia going where they've gone lately. Armenia is in this very fragile, I would say, post-war situation, and I'm not even sure I would characterize it as positive at this point, but that's kind of the only one left. That's though the more traditional way I would say that we've always thought about it. When I've come to speak at Harriman, this is sort of the conversation we've often had is like, what does the map look like? But of course, what we all know, and I think what everyone knows now, what's interesting about this moment is that it is an integrated view now. It's not just us looking at the map, like you were saying, Alex, us looking out, it's us looking in and looking around us and trying to figure out something that connects through activist networks, through a human rights movement, at least in principle, that is global. And that's actually transnational, including activists within our own societies. I don't know if it's going to get worse. What I would say it's going to get different. I still think what we're in right now is the fallout stage. It's certainly what it feels like to me is that we're still in this period of time in which institutional legacy organizations and legacy infrastructure around supporting activism and supporting human rights movements has, I wouldn't say it's all disappeared. It's not all gone. We all know there are certain organizations still operating, but I mean, Tanya's experience, my experience, Freedom House, these big legacy organizations like OSF, like Freedom House are just not going to be what they were. They are totally transformed in the last several years for OSF, in the last year for Freedom House. And so there is going to be something very different that comes, and whether it comes 6 months from now or 2 years from now, it's going to be building now. And I don't know if it'll be worse in that way. It might actually, some of it might actually be better.
Well, we still have the internet there. I feel like to me, that's the thing.
Yeah, and it may
It could still be taken away.
Right. Yes. Well, no, I'm not saying, trust me, I can come up with all kinds of scenarios where it gets worse. I just, I think so. Then to talk more a bit about impact and to try to make that a bit more concrete. I mean, I think that certainly at Freedom House and in a lot of the more kind of conventional circles, the global human rights movement and promotion of democracy, not to conflate the two, slightly different things, but it was what I would sometimes call like, it was a bank shot strategy. So the idea was you were going to influence, influential governments to influence other governments. That was most of it. I mean, obviously you were doing direct advocacy with the government of Kyrgyzstan or Kazakhstan or whomever, but a lot of the time really what you were doing is you were going to USAID, you were talking to them about what the priority should be and hoping that USAID would then pressure the Kazakh government or provide funding for local civil society or pressure, et cetera. So it was all about this like bounce off the wall and get the other side. That's gone, to state the obvious, with the US. I would say it's probably gone with Europe if it was ever there. I don't know that Europe was ever particularly interested in playing that role anyway. And so there is going to be something there that has to be recreated if people want to actually have any kind of external dimension in terms of influence on human rights movements and influence on human rights performance in these countries. But I don't think there's there's no ready strategy that's there to grab onto. There's nothing that's there right now to replace it. And so that, again, I think it's this fallout period where we're not sure what people bring in or what they build. And I think there's going to be a lot of different attempts. I don't think people will stop trying. I think there will be a lot of different versions of it, and there will be a lot of different ways of going about it. And it's possible, again, that what would come out of it may be better. But it's just going to be a very, very different one. The last big one I would say is that there's this transformation that is happening. So obviously there's a transformation that's happened in American politics, including on these issues. And I sort of bracket that, perhaps because we're all maybe thinking about it too much all the time anyway. There's a huge transformation happening in European, Canadian, British politics around this as well. And it's not unidirectional. It's not like it's all positive. It's not that it's all negative. I would characterize it as there's a new kind of attitude about a democracy that fights, about a confrontational defense of democracy. That's the language that von der Leyen uses. You hear this a lot from Macron. I would say in the UK, it's sort of present, even if Starmer is not the person who's going to articulate it. And I think that, again, so on the positive side of that, there's a very heavy awareness that there are like deep existential threats to democracy that are coming from outside. They might be coming from Russian penetration or foreign interference or other foreign interference actors. They might be coming from the US. And there's very clear recognition of this if you talk to non-US policymakers right now. Nobody is unaware of that. The question is, I think, who does it fight for? So democracy that fights, who does it fight for? Does it fight for externally? Does it fight for people in other countries? Is it in solidarity with activists and actors in other countries who are pro-democratic and who want to see human rights built as norms? I think that's an open question. I'm not sure it is. Like democracy that fights might be a lot more transactional. It might be a lot more mercenary. There's definitely an argument that it could go that direction. There's also a question about who it fights for within those democracies. So when von der Leyen or whomever talks about, defending democracy and protecting democracy, there is at the same time this very strong countervailing sentiment in Europe, in North America, in the UK, to exclude large numbers of people from that definition, right? And to build a more ethno-nationalist kind of definition of who's included in the society, and to defend that. And it's happening right at the same time. It's all happening together, I think. Alex maybe is disagreeing.
Yeah, no, I do agree.
And I think that's kind of this is the most interesting part in working on transnational repression, working on these questions around exile and diaspora. This is the part that's most interesting, is trying to figure out a way to connect the need to defend the rights of all the people who are there, regardless of what their migration status is or what their residency is, their citizenship, with squaring the need to actually protect the democracy from real external threats, and building an agenda that's actually inclusive of all of these goals.
Nick, can I ask you just to take a minute and talk a little bit about what we mean by the dynamic of transnational repression? It'll be familiar to some of the community, but maybe not others, like in the two ledgers of that, the two sides of that.
Yeah, I mean, at a basic level, we just mean states seeking ways to silence people who are in other states, who will have some sort of national connection back to that state. So we call them exiles and diasporas for shorthand. And that can then span all kinds of tactics, from digital surveillance or digital threats and pressure, spyware, hacking, pressure on their families who are still in the origin state, but also manipulation of migration systems is a very big important part of this. Most of the if you look at the Freedom House data that I helped create, most of the incidents in it take place through detentions and deportations, through the origin state's ability to engineer outcomes where people are detained or deported by the host state's migration system. So there's a close relationship there in terms of whether you can build a migration system that's impervious to that, or at least less pervious, less penetrable. And the building a rights protection agenda for people who have come, regardless really of whether they're human rights defenders or not, just regarding whether they're vulnerable to that pressure.
Great, thank you. So I'm next up. I'm shamelessly taking up some time on the panel to make three observations. One on an aspect of Rachel's advocacy I think is really important and I admire. A second, a macro point on why we miss this sort of impact closed society story, I think, both analytically and as advocacy organizations, and maybe some suggestions for kind of in this different world of advocacy sort of targets in this area. So one of the things and I know this wasn't supposed to be a Rachel fest, but it is. And I'll tell you very concretely, now more than ever, when everything seems depressing and going in one direction and so forth, one of the real contributions of Rachel's work is she finds issues, yes, that are difficult, but are important, but illustrate the stakes of our times through detail, documentation, and just flat out bravery of the targets. So whether it's talking about the Chechen government, right, targeting and rounding up gay men, whether it's looking at the actual curriculum that Russian occupying authorities have put in for school children in Ukraine, whether it's looking at examples of how the Turkmen government and Turkish counterparts are coordinated, conspiring, I guess, to sort of prevent, these returns. It's all very concrete. Yes, it's all part of the same backlash, but she gives us documentary insights into these personal experiences. And all three of these areas are like just super difficult to access it. But she's the driving force to say, we need these stories. We need to understand what's going on, even if we do have a general sense that things are bad. So thank you for that. And that's just been of real importance to all of us.
I just have to stop 1 second to say that that's work that I worked on, but certainly, as you can imagine, this is work that my colleagues did.
Absolutely.
Right. These are the hardworking folks in the Europe and Central Asia division at Human Rights Watch and beyond, and our colleagues in the organizations that we work together with. I mean, I appreciate trust me, I'm blushing deeply at the tribute, but it's obviously work that reflects the efforts of so many people who have put themselves and sometimes their safety, their reputations on the line. So I have to say that now.
Well said. No, thank you. Second analytical point. I think one of the reasons why we have been so slow, maybe slow, but so taken aback by the progression of all of these spaces becoming closed, sort of analytically, is we started with a different set of assumptions and a different set of understandings of what constituted impact, right? When the space was more open, right? The playbook, of course, there were regional and country differences. Of course, we understood Turkmenistan was different. But there was a sense that, okay, you've signed up to these treaties, right? We do have foundations operating. We have different national and developmental networks operating in all these places. This is an infrastructure. There is a fabric there that we can work with, right, in the advocacy space. And so it wasn't unreasonable, right, to think that we could impact this change. And again, you know, holding governments accountable to the commitments that they had made. But obviously from 2009 and sort of later, the space starts to change. It starts to close. Actors start to be stigmatized. They get kicked out. The fabrics are cut. They're reworked, and we are where we are. I find it kind of ironic. This is something I'd like to delve into more analytically. That as this is happening, right, the beginning maybe of the backlash in the late 2000s, mid 2000s, late 2000s, in the advocacy world. We start adopting more and more the norms and standards internally of the development world, right? The log frames of the outcomes, the assessments, right? Like, you know, yes, theories of change, but like, how do you measure the impact that you had? And, you know, we all did the best that we could in this circumstance, and then seeing all three of you do it. But I would say, you know, the prior question was, are we really using a suitable model here? Right, to fight back against something, right? It's one thing to create sort of positive change and so forth, but slowing the boulder is itself important. It's an impact, but I feel like it wasn't viewed as such or treated as such internally in perhaps some of the higher up offices and where we all worked in or kind of advised in. So that would be sort of my analytical observation. It's a very different moment now, and perhaps I think take Nate's sort of positive lining, if we're not encumbered by that, by the log frames of development, how do we rethink impact, right? In terms of closed society and backlash. And then my third point, just some sort of new targets. Here's a few I was thinking about in this new world. One, completely on board with Tanya. We've also written about this sort of exiles and exile policies. And I think it's important to define what exiles can and can't do. I feel like sometimes there's such a resistance to exiles, both because they're stigmatized because they're no longer in the region or in country, right? They no longer have knowledge or understanding. And that's actually quite anachronistic. It ignores the fact that a lot of journalists, certainly those investigating, say, corruption, work with online administrative data anyway, right? Like they have their kind of networks and sources. But it also sets the bar in a really kind of dangerous way that I think reveals a lot. Well, exiles aren't politically consequential, right? They're not going to go back into government. That's a really high and strange understanding of why someone might be sort of consequential. The fact that they're not an actual political player or won't be in the future, right? And I find that's often sort of deployed in sort of, you know, especially in reference to the new Russian exiles, like they don't matter, they're not consequential, they're not actually having that kind of impact. But I think for all sorts of reasons, these are the work of exile journalists needs to be sustained, right, and encouraged. Second, yes, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to do advocacy work and certainly traditional naming and shaming work in closed societies. But it's more feasible to go after those organizations, especially in so-called liberal democracies, who enable these authoritarians, right? So they don't work alone. This has certainly been true of kleptocracy, but it's certainly true of authoritarians too. Reputation management firms, PR firms, and lobbying firms. I would even say sort of the wealth managers of particular sort of ruling families and clans, like a colleague at Dartmouth Sociology, Brooke Harrington, has a really good piece about this in terms of sort of sanctions, that there are vulnerabilities in these service providers. They're not doing anything illegal, but we might find what they're doing to be just like ethically, like really problematic, if not repugnant, right? And so they're the vulnerable ones. And it really strikes me how reputation management firms that stifle sort of criticism, clamp down on news stories themselves, almost get away sort of unscathed, right? Because it seems to me the way to get at reputation management firms is to challenge their own reputation and judgment, right? So I would say that's the sort of the second one. And then the final one is just drawing a little bit on the discussion yesterday with Alex Dukalski. When these closed societies have international events that are quite obviously involved as sort of image-making events or reputation laundering events, and of course, you know, Rachel has been involved in advocacy about sort of Sochi and some of the other campaigns. These are opportunities. But I think the opportunities also need to be sort of targeted in a smart way, right? If there are, and by that I mean the international federations that stage these events and sanctions them, right? The International Olympic Committee, you know, FIFA, so forth. Those are particularly sort of good targets, right? Even though they might not want to bother anymore with activists, but still, they're the vulnerable ones, not necessarily the governments and the corporate sponsors of these events, right? Those are also other targets where, again, you try and take the particular purpose of the event, which is sort of reputation management and building, and go after it on those grounds. So, you know, none of these are really the kind of on the ground, kind of working with sort of local civil society partners, right? The way that we sort of drew it up or idealized it perhaps in the 90s, but we have to adjust. And I think in some ways we have to realize that we are implicated in the system of closed societies, right? In ways that perhaps is still uncomfortable for us to acknowledge. And with that, right on schedule, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel for her own thoughts, comments, critiques, and reflections.
Thank you. And Alex, Hugh, thank you so much for organizing this discussion. Tanya, Nate, Alex, Jack, Hugh, your comments are so on the mark. And I wish, honestly, I wish that with the past 34 years, we could have had this conversation every week. I'm really honored that you decided to have this conversation coinciding with my departure from Human Rights Watch. And it really, again, it couldn't be more timely. It would have been timely a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago. I don't know, let's see, where should I start? Well, maybe I'll start by picking up the threads a couple of threads that Nate, you and that everyone has articulated already. First on the notion that we're, you know, where are we? And the fallout that we probably can't even see that we're still amid. I can't help thinking that, you know, we have such a rush of information, such an abundance of information that hits us all the time, you know, and that's thanks to the work of, you know, of exiles, of people taking risks in closed societies to keep their, you know, their information systems moving, and not to even mention the not closed societies. We're in a big churn, and I think that because we have a historic churn, and because we have access to so much information, we tend to think that, I mean, I know I tend to think that, well, this is, you know, this is where we are, and this is how it's going to be, and you know, I just wonder where we're going to, you know, in 5 years when we look back, are we going to look back and think, boy, you know, those were the good old days. We, you know, honestly, we are in.
To me.
No, we should. I hope that we'll still be here in 5 years, in 10 years, or even in 20 years, and we'll look back at this moment and think, well, what did we miss?
Right.
Where were we really headed? Where were our blinders? And then let me just start by saying that it's not that I'm as someone who worked in this sector for, for several decades, it's not that I think that having theories of change and having, impact goals and the like is a waste of time, no matter how much I might have complained about having to do all the written work. Can't we just have a conversation about it instead? Obviously it is very useful. And vitally important. If you don't know why you're doing what you're doing, you don't deserve to be, honestly, you don't deserve to be doing it. But I have to say, it has been challenging even in the best of times, and even in the societies that in the spaces that were the most open to civic movements, and where there was the most fertile and positive circumstances, and when there's funding, when there's the civic organizations that are working together, when there's broader public support beyond the organizations because they're serving a community. Even then, first, it's incredibly hard to make change, right? Because most of the time you're asking for governments to change their practices, and when you're asking for non-state actors to change their practices, it can be even harder. You're asking people to change their practices. You're asking bureaucracies to change. We all know that bureaucracies can be like molasses, and they all have all kinds their vested interests. And we just have circumstances that we can't control. And so it's incredibly hard, even in the most auspicious circumstances. And the second thing I can remember across the years is, even the types of change the kind of change we would be able to achieve in these, auspicious circumstances wasn't the one we planned. It was something else. Right. And so that's why sometimes these planning exercises got kind of frustrating, because you go into it, you think, how arrogant do you have to be to have this theory of change where everything plotted out, when you know that, who knows? Maybe we'll get this, but maybe we'll get that. And really, who knows? It's not a lot, it's not chemistry we're doing, which I was terrible at anyway. And then the third thing is on let's see, change when we can't predict it. I can't remember what the third point I wanted to make about the nature of change in when you have the most auspicious circumstances. Well, when I say most auspicious circumstances, I just want to acknowledge, because I think if I'm channeling you a little bit, Jack, and I mean even when you have connection with public movements, and channeling what you said about Kyrgyzstan, even when there is that connection with when there is civic organizations that are working closely with a constituency, that would go to bat, that would be upset if they got squashed. Even then, it can be really hard to get change. Often the kind of change we were able to sometimes the easiest change would be getting internet mechanisms adopted, international mechanisms, right? We used to call these back long ago as virtual victories, because you would be able to get a new UN mechanism adopted, or I don't want to call this a virtual victory because it is a step towards justice. Sometimes the reporting, the documentation that we did, the reports that we did would end up feeding into cases at the European Court of Human Rights. That delivers a measure of justice. It gives the plaintiff a sense that they were heard. But does that really affect wider change? And then even in these cases where the most auspicious cases, when we were able, in many cases, I think human rights groups have been able to secure amazing policy changes, the degree to which they've taken root. I think you can question. And then, of course, I'm not getting into I'm talking about in our region. I'm not even getting into just some of the really landmark, huge, positive things that international human rights organizations, local human rights organizations have done over the past 30 years. So I think that there are really big it's I guess to be expected that there would be big expectations that that human rights groups would be able to continue to have impact, and that we keep the same definitions of impact. It's change, being able to change policies, practices, laws in a way that has a direct impact on human life, on people's lives, to relieve discrimination, to relieve injustice, to relieve whether it's social economic injustice or other types of injustice. In the time when of transition, and then obviously in societies that are now full on tyrannies, I mean, obviously we have that needs to be revisited. And I found it very, I mean, this isn't a tell-all session, but I found it quite frustrating in the years of, as we were moving further, deeper and deeper into autocracy, and also in the countries that were always frozen. I mean, always, like Turkmenistan, that never had an opening. How do you explain what impact is going to be there? But I did find it, very, very frustrating as Russia got, particularly, Russia and Belarus, and then quickly Azerbaijan, as they got increasingly autocratic. How do we, what can we say was our, when we report to donors, when we report to the public, what can we say? What did we actually do?
Right.
What was our real impact? And I think that we need to, which is why we're having this conversation here. And I think we need to redefine what that impact is. But I think also that people are already doing that, as our conversations reflecting so far. And I think even I think Human Rights Watch is doing that now. I think, and I've heard, I hear from our colleagues some of the colleagues who were here at the Harriman on Wednesday at the event with Russian human rights defenders. They find it frustrating. I think they find it frustrating having to continually, persuade their supporters and their donors that they can continue to do this work. That you can't have the same kind of 5-year plan. You can't define impact in the same way. Impact is going to be, it's going to be, maybe its impact should be defined. And this is really where I'm getting to the crux of it. Maybe the impact needs to be defined in terms of how are we in these super autocratic countries, where there are growing numbers of people enduring severe repression, people who want to keep, I don't want to use any cliches, who want to keep democracy alive, who people who realize that there is a huge chasm between what the government is doing and what's normal. Who don't want to see this kind of twisted, perverse repression normalized. And so how do we make an impact on their lives? And I think that, first there are just the people who are suffering in the worst way from that repression. And here I also, I think we have to talk about impact in terms of the impact that we make on anybody's life if they're paying the biggest price, if they're behind bars. Impact is, I think you said this, making them know, Tanya, helping them know that they're not alone, and know that their story is being told, and making clear that helping them, making it possible through the support of organizations that are doing this to support their families so that they can, people who are behind bars can have access to, have a better shot at getting medical care, better shot at getting the food packages, better shot at getting letters that might sustain their resilience. Basically, it's, we don't know how long this tyrannical moment is going to endure. It could be, it could be generations. We don't know, but I think we want to give them the best shot at even at just surviving. And I think when you talk to, I can't speak for everybody. Everybody's different, but often when we speak to people who have managed to survive, in political, imprisonments, and we ask them, how did you do it? How did you? There are various mechanisms that people adopt, but more often than, very often people would say, if knowing that there were people out there who knew who were fighting for them, made a difference. I just had that conversation with somebody even yesterday that it makes a difference, and so I think that do you tell a donor that? Do you say, well, this is the difference that we've made in this person's life, in this person's concrete life, and not just in this person, in the lives of their families, because imprisonment, imprisonment is a crisis, not just for the person who's there, but for their whole family, their wide family circle. It's a crisis, and the crisis can be, on so many levels, in need of emotional support, but legal support, financial support. And also, and this is where just the importance of lawyers could not be more critical, really, because the lawyers who are, they're the link between the people who are in prison and the outside world, obviously, but also they're essential for families and loved ones to help them navigate this machine, this repressive machine. So, I mean, I think that we need to think about, impact in those terms, having that kind of difference in terms of individual lives. Also, I also think about the impact that we make, the way I don't know how you measure it, but this is also picking up the thread that you just spooled out, Tanya, how you measure the way that you have made it possible in country to give people not only access to information, but keep them in a place where they know that what is happening is perverse and wrong, and they're willing. I don't think we can take responsibility for people to go out the street and protest, because that's, that means more people in jail. But for people to know that it's, that it's perverse and it's wrong, and to keep that alive, to keep them thirsting for information, for thirsting for better, for a better life, and for more, for more access, for more information. I just have another point on, the kind of exile versus people in country. Not to repeat what you already said, but just to build on that, I think that you have those tensions of, exile versus in country, even within the organizations that are operating in hybrid. I mean, and I think that too many people, even today, don't realize, just to preface this by saying, too many people don't realize just how much work is being done inside closed country, inside Russia, inside Belarus, under the radar. Probably still inside Azerbaijan. I think Azerbaijan. I think it's and I don't think people realize that. And I think also that because it is hybrid, and it involves people taking enormous risks. And I think even within these organizations that are doing that hybrid work, there are tensions. Not that they don't understand. That the exiles don't necessarily understand what's happening inside, but they're feeling these pressures in very different ways, and the stakes are very different for the people who are still on the ground. I could go on and on, but let me just maybe one more point. There's kind of a taboo at human rights organizations, a taboo about doing. Obviously, about saying that you're doing work because you want to set the record. The record needs to be a record needs to be created. We need to make sure that this is on the record. When human rights organizations do project memos, I think the best way to kill your project is to say, we want to do this with a historical record. Never ever say that. But I think we need to acknowledge that record is very important. I'm sorry that I wish Anna Nemza were here now. She's she was at the event on Wednesday. Perhaps some of you have seen the brilliant and monumental film, My Undesirable Friends, the 4.5 or maybe 5.5 hour 5.5 hour documentary about the end of the period just before the full-scale invasion, when journalists in Russia were getting tagged as foreign agents, and just the collapse of everything. So it seemed. Anyway, at one point, she, she's musing about, she's talking about why, or Anna is asked, well, why do people continue to do this? And she said that Anna said that this is a question that she keeps asking journalists over, these are journalists that we're talking about, journalists over and over again, and human rights defenders. Why do you continue to do this work when we're obviously facing this inexorable, powerful machine that's steamrolling us? I'm paraphrasing. This is not actually what she said. And the answer was always, yeah, we know it might be, we know we might be getting steamrolled, but we have to create this record.
Yeah.
And again, I think in 25 years, when we look back at this era, what the record will, the record of what happened will be chronicled by many different people, or many different types of people, be chronicled by journalists, it will be chronicled by historians and political scientists. But, maybe this is something we should discuss, when I finally stop talking. But will it not also be helpful to see it chronicled in the particular lens of how all of this, was in violation of certain norms, how it affected individual people's lives, using the methodology of human rights documentation? Will that chronicle not also be an important part of the record?
Yeah, well said. Okay, let's move on to your own comments and questions. A reminder, if you are joining us online, please use the Q&A function to ask a question, and we'll get it. Let's take an initial round, and then I think we'll give the panel a chance to respond to the questions, and perhaps what else has been sort of mentioned here. Start with Dan.
So just what you were just now saying, Rachel, what if you'd said that to the people who did chronicle current events? This is pointless. Why are you?
Yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Yes.
I'll say about very true. That's Harriman. Alex talked about opportunities to turn the gaze inwards. Use the time to also self-reflect, reckon, and so on. Where we may have made mistakes. I wonder if we can hear from the panelists about where we may have gone wrong, and not only with reference to not achieving what we set out, without further involved human rights, not getting it in the end. But really, and maybe in particular, whether we could have done anything to preempt the kind of sovereignty, in particular the sovereignty with crack that we're facing at post-solution. And the second, if I may, very briefly, Nate talked about transformations globally, including in the established orders, where one of the things we're seeing is the retreat from some of the global instruments, some of the legal frameworks. Britain and Poland talking about leading the European Convention, Latvia now eventually becoming the first EU member state to keep the Istanbul Compact and so forth. I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on the role of those frameworks, and what does this retreat from these instruments mean? Do we need to rethink the tools that we use? Do we need to rethink the kind of universalisms that we brought into these frameworks? And maybe more positively, do we start thinking about the future frameworks, about upgrading those tools for the next generation?
Great, thank you, Stephen. Let's take one more. Anyone there? Panel? Yes, Masha.
I'm curious about bridging.
Introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry. I'm Masha. I work at the Harriman Institute. I edit the magazine. And I'm curious about the bridge, donors often have different ideas than what's good for people on the ground, and how to bridge that gap when we're kind of rebuilding this new framework of human rights.
Great. Okay, perfect. A lot to chew on there. Should we start? Tanya, Nate, Rachel.
I'm happy to tackle some of kind of like a little bit from each of these questions. Well, it's your questions to the donors, because presumably I'm the only person here who's been in the business. I think, again, it's not kind of too late to try to push the donors to think differently, because the game's not over, like people are still funding, there's still ways to support on the ground, people on the ground, like it's still ongoing. It feels a little bit like a eulogy, and it should, but things are still happening. And I think in a way, a lot of what's happened in Russia now and the way donors are forced to operate is actually much better, because who's going to be sitting there and doing a monitoring and evaluation report for, 2,000 crypto dollars that we passed via 13 set, intermediaries. Like no one can do that. And so finally people are just saying like, we need money and people are sending the money. That's how it should have always been. So hopefully some lessons are being derived from that. And we are now sending this message to US donors a lot, saying like, stop collecting all this data about your grantees here in the US. You're literally preparing cases for the DOJ to go after them. If you trusted a grantee, if you trust a partner, just send the money. I mean, all of this industrial complex of monitoring and learning evaluation has just gone completely out of control. So that's one thing. To the question of, I'm forgetting a little bit part of your first part of your question about
why do we prevent
differently?
We preempted the rise of the sovereign.
So I think it's, I reflect, I don't feel like I have had control over what those governments were doing, but I think a lot about what we did wrong in terms of not supporting civil society on the ground enough, and kind of the approaches the donors took. And again, I think a big one really is, one thing US does have to teach the world, I think, it's not the democracy lesson, I think it's community organizing. Like this country actually has a ton of powerful lessons about organizing within communities. And I think much too late, we figured it out, like in terms of, I'm talking about my own experience. And in Georgia and Armenia, we did start bringing actual community organizers to folks there and telling them like, because for example, we were working a lot with LGBT communities and we would ask them, okay, so who are your like natural allies? And they'd be like, my LGBT group. And it's like, well, what about your neighbor? Like people who've seen you grow up, from childhood. How can you be vilified in their eyes if they've known you their whole lives? So like the propaganda surely should not work on them. Oh, it never occurred to me to talk to them. So these very basic community organizing concepts were very foreign in our region. And again, of course, there's historical precedent as to why that is, et cetera. But I think if we had done more of that earlier on, when we were instead doing these, human rights workshops and human rights schools, again, not saying that it should have been an either or, but in donor world, it's always an either or. I think that would have been very powerful. And I think it would have made a huge difference. And second thing, I'll take my own kind of like, I blame myself for it, is that it's these incremental investments, right? Yeah. We make people do so much lifting for teeny amounts of money every year, every 6 months. I mean, it was absurd. Like, I really think looking back on it, I worked at a very well-researched institution. We should have poured money on the ground to support these lawyers to, rather than, again, making them fight over these teeny pots, because there wasn't scarcity inside. It was like invented scarcity internally. And I'll say third thing, and it's reflecting a little bit on like we're doing it, taking a lot of blame on ourselves as we should. But I actually, and together with Harriman, have worked to push Russian civil society to think a little bit about the future. Because I think the disconnect has always been like, we can't think past tomorrow because our lives are so hard. And we're saying, give us a 5-year plan. And that was like always the problem. But actually, we learned that they can be pushed to think about the future. And it's actually very useful to them. So 2 years ago, together with Columbia, we brought Russian journalists together whose horizon of planning, identified by them, varied between 1 week and 3 months. And we forced them to think about 6 months. And we forced them to think very proactively about YouTube shutdown. This is in 2023. And it took, exactly. And it took a lot of framing to be like, I know you don't think past tomorrow. I know you live day to day, all the things. And also future planning can be a very powerful tool for people who have no control over the future. And they came up with 1 million things to fight the YouTube shutdown, which of course turned into a slowdown that we're seeing right now. Like Dosh invented its own VPN. Like, we're seeing them implement a lot of the things we came up with 2 years ago, because actually when you force them to think like you have control over the future, even if it's a fake world we're thinking of, they leave quite empowered. And so I think it needs to be a little bit of two-way. Like, we need to acknowledge all the things we could have done differently, but we should also, there's been a little bit of an infantilizing of civil society there. And I think it's okay for us to push them also a little bit and say, okay, like, I know you can't think past tomorrow, but like, you really should.
Interesting. Nate.
Yeah, it's funny. So, to your point, I mean, I very much agree with Tanya's point about the amounts of money and kind of putting money in people's hands. I mean, it goes back to like the stories I was sort of brought up when I'm a little younger. Think about the suitcases, the cash in the belt. Correct. On the planes, people flying out to Novosibirsk with like
and just giving
stacks of money and just like handing money to people and being like, go do civil society, organize it. Yeah, or write a book or buy a printing press. Right. Like, and print out leaflets. Anyway, all the stuff that was going on in the 90s. And so these questions about could we have done anything different to prevent the sovereigntists? And I guess I'll sort of package it with the ECHR question. I mean, It's not going to be a satisfying answer. I think that this, so if we look at the attack on the Istanbul Convention and the attack on ECHR, these are just politicized attacks. They are straight up politicized attacks by a politicized movement. They have to be met with political attacks. These political responses. They aren't political. These are not technical discussions, because the stuff that's being said about ECHR regarding migration in the UK and Poland, it's lies. Like it's just false. And you got to fight it. You got to fight it with politics. I mean, frankly, the biggest mistake has been to say, oh, you know, there's something here we should talk about. We should have like a real, like, you got to get out there and make your case. The ECHR makes the UK safer. The ECHR makes the UK better, right? Like, it protects your rights. It's also part of national law, right? Incorporated in the UK national law. And the stuff that these people are saying is false. And frankly, it's very frustrating. I mean, it's been a real frustration now for a long time, but there's been a real failure to like take on these attacks as the politicized attacks that they are, and stand up for the institutions. You know, I don't know, you know, new frameworks. I think new frameworks will be developed. I mean, I'm in conversations with people who are talking about all kinds of different sort of treaty instruments or other ideas at the UN, at Council of Europe, in different bodies. So in Europe, but also in other multilateral places. I think there's always going to be new initiatives. But I would separate those conversations, because those conversations are among, I think, people who are intending to bolster a kind of human rights framework and build a human rights framework. But the problem is that the attacks is coming from people who reject the premise, right? They reject the whole idea, and they're using this as a wedge to get in and tear the whole thing down. And it is working. I mean, for sure, like the Istanbul Convention stuff has now been going on for God knows how. I mean, Croatia, I know you said like Croatia almost got there whenever that was, right? Like 7 or 8 years ago. I mean, Turkey, yeah, Turkey did get there, right? Not EU, but you know, like, it's been going on. The Istanbul Convention thing at this point is a trope, right? And we just have to, we gotta like build alliances, build coalitions, and fight in the streets, but like in the same way that they are, right? Fight in the media, fight in public for these values, because otherwise you just lose. You know, these aren't technical. They're not treating it as a technical discussion, and we shouldn't treat it as a technical discussion. Is my opinion.
Yeah, and just to pick up on that, another way of, or another maybe a critical component of fighting is making sure that, you know, in the societies where you're operating and where the sovereigntists are trying to empty these their conventional obligations of any meeting, or just take them down entirely. I mean, you need to have people who feel they have a stake in the values reflecting these conventions, and I think I think that is work that we had, that I know that I've been involved in. I think that it's work that other organizations have been involved in. Just to give you an example where it might be, quickly relevant, take the example of Georgia, right? Where I don't think they're talking about leaving the ECHR, but who knows?
Right.
Why?
Certainly.
You know, we really need to make sure we have an active imagination now.
Yeah.
Shortly before, a couple of years before this really hard authoritarian turn that George has taken, we started doing a different kind of work in Georgia that involved trying to build a coalition for. Unfortunately, this isn't going to have a happy end. So just alert.
What were you pivoting from before you explain what you moved to in Georgia?
In the
What was that?
In the coalition.
So the coalition was about labor rights.
Okay.
It was, we were trying to, you know, we had done a lot of solid reporting on how the super low safety standards in the mining in mining operations in Georgia, and how the low standards had to do with problems not only in, you know, the enforcement of safety, but also in the violation of certain labor rights. I don't want to get into it here, but there were pretty core labor rights that had to do with, you know, hours and how wages were calculated, and that the way wages were calculated had a direct impact on labor safety, right? So we were part of a coalition, and, you know, to its credit, your OSF gave a lot of support for this to happen. We tried to create, good for them. We created, you know, we understood that there was no way that, you know, we did this report and we got a couple of, pieces of impact off of it, having to do with the transparency of labor inspection reports. But, there was so much more that needed to be done in order to sustain a demand for change in labor rights. So, we tried to bring together, we tried to be like the silent partner in bringing together organizations that could mobilize various parts of the workforce to create a demand for Georgia to implement its obligations under both the Convention on Social and Economic Rights and the European Convention on Social and Economic Rights. Unfortunately, this doesn't have a happy end because when the government adopted its foreign agents law, the new foreign agents laws, and started its huge crackdown, many of the organizations now that were at the forefront of this coalition, they have other things to worry about now.
Yeah.
So,
Rachel, did you think about, instead of petitioning the government to deal with the problem, organizing the workers to go on strike?
well, we don't organize, human rights organizations don't organize workers to go on strike. I mean, I think some of them did have strikes, but I think that's just.
But let me rephrase the question. Create networks that had knowledge and social ties that would have made it much easier for the workers to hint that they could go on strike because they knew what they were doing and they were organized.
Yeah. So this is why there was this coalition, because the labor unions and NGOs that were part of the coalition would have had those connections and would have had that technical know-how. That's not something that we had. We tried to create other tools that would keep this network of organizations and labor and independent labor unions together. But I'm just throwing that out there as an example for how human rights organizations can try to really be part of a public coalition to prevent, to create a demand, so that if there's an effort to walk away from convention standards because of the sovereignty argument, well, look what the US does, and they don't give a hoot about any international standards, so we can do the same. That you need to, if you can somehow embed an expectation that these rights will be protected, it could make it harder for government to walk away.
Yeah, good. Okay, let's go to second round of questions, and at some point, Hugh, I'd also like to come back to you maybe for your thoughts and reflections a little bit on the discussion too, towards the end.
About how we're going to start organizing workers to go on strike.
Exactly. We'll put you on the spot there. More questions from the audience here. Please.
I'm Michael Kocha, I'm a graduate student at the European Institute. My question is for Mr. Schenkkan. You mentioned the concept of defense of democracies. You said it was an open-ended question for who it defends. Is it external? Is it internal? If it's internal, is it exclusionary? My question about that is, how do you view the momentum heading in the development of that concept in liberal democracies?
Okay, great. Let's take another few. Anyone else? Yeah, Gail.
So I'm Gail Castillo. So my question about sort of lessons learned and also the future and theories of change is, it seems as if the theory of change in some regards with regard to civil society is that, or civil organizations, is that either the government will listen, the government doesn't listen, then you go out onto the streets. And what I've been wondering about, and I'd be interested in your thoughts, is whether another sort of piece to this puzzle would be for, especially these civil society organizations that, for reasons we all understand, were funded at a moment in time by overseas organizations that can be run by elites in cities. Is there another possibility for them to create partnerships with the private sector? And with the private sector the private sector can speak the voice of power. The private sector has has powered the purse, right? It hires people, it moves to the best method, et cetera. And I just wondering about idea of his students doing the future.
Yeah, good. That's an important factor. Yes, please.
Yes, I'm Margolin. Yes, I'm a journalist, former editorial director of the Cooley to Protect Journalists. You've touched on this briefly, but I'm wondering about expanded roles and support for lawyers, both in country and outside of the countries affected. We understand the importance of telling the stories of these people and that it has a great psychological benefit. But as we also mentioned, the naming and shaming no longer works. But, sometimes lawyers, if they're trained properly and if they're not being intimidated, can make, a tangible difference. So I'm just wondering again, you mentioned another piece of the puzzle, if that kind of sort of another support leg, as it were, would not be helpful.
Great, thank you for that. Okay, that's our final round of questions. We will extend to 1:35, 5 minutes, so we can get these last reflections in. Hugh, why don't we start with you? Some of your reflections on some of these issues, as well as the discussion that you've been listening to and you've facilitated here today.
Thank you so much, Alec. A couple of points. One is sort of reflecting on what you said, Rachel. I should have expected it, but I really appreciate the way you did it. That you rooted the conversation in sort of fundamental, basic human rights work. You talked about food parcels for people in prison. You talked about family members knowing their loved ones are safe. I think it's really important to root this conversation, to ground this conversation in those sorts of perspectives. That's what motivates us at a fundamental level as human rights activists and staff of human rights organizations. And as we think about how, this space, this Eurasia space is going to evolve with more challenges of making impact, I think that's really important to have that starting point. Secondly, I think what we've talked about as having a sort of nuanced understanding of the current situation on the ground in these countries is really important as we think about how to deal with these challenges. We've talked about, and you talked about it as well, Rachel, sort of the issues around sort of the fact that there are still, courageous human rights activists working in country, I'd say in Russia or Belarus, even, and we should remember that, and the sort of the challenges and the tensions between exiled and in country activists sort of influencing the shape of human rights work and so on. I think those are sort of to understand the nuance of and fast changing nature of the situation is really important. It influences our work at Human Rights Watch and what you've brought, Rachel, for so many years, that sort of understanding and challenge to us constantly to be nuanced in our ways forward and not to be sort of simplistic in our ways of thinking. And thirdly, I would pick up on what Nate talked about, transnational repression. That's it's a Human Rights Watch has been working on this issue for decades, and it now has this convenient label, and that's helpful. And it's also what you've been working on. You worked on for many years, Rachel, I think. And what you said, Nate, really reminds me of that challenge we face in the modern era. I'm based in Germany, as Alex said, and Human Rights Watch, for instance, here is part of a network of exiled groups in Germany, some from Eurasia, some from elsewhere, that face transnational repression here. And it really challenges us to sort of understand what human rights work means these days, because it connects a rich European country with Belarus and with Azerbaijan and with Tajikistan, and it's the modern face, unfortunately, of repression and human rights work. So that's what I've taken away from this. Thank you so much again for organizing it.
Thank you, Hugh.
Back to you, Alex.
Jack, let's go to you for some of your thoughts on the panel.
Well, this has been a terrific discussion that lays out the problems very clearly. I've been trying to process it in a way that fits with normal framework that I use when I think about creating human rights realities in circumstances that are hard ones. Often these kinds of countries lack basic preconditions for a rights-based social order. They lack institutions, social networks, attitudes, knowledge, and the task of the theory of change in these circumstances is to try to create some of those preconditions so that you can then build your rights structure on top of those preconditions. And this is, in my view, mostly a task for harnessing social power and social interests. So 5 quick bullet points in rapid fire. First, most human rights advances in history have happened through the self-interested efforts of the people and groups that see themselves as benefiting for the rights that they get from their actions. I think in the Harriman region, labor rights is a good place to start, in part because labor rights are inherently class rights rather than culture and identity rights, and so is a good stepping stone to a human rights goal. Number 2, promote human rights with vernacular discourse and using indigenous messengers. Number 3, tailor your aims to the interests and power of your rights coalition. If you have workers, do something with the workers. If you have lawyers, do something with the lawyers, etc. Like work with the building blocks of people who have an interest and a motivation and some leverage in society to get things done. Fourth, and related to that, is organize around the least provocative issue that you can find as a way of building your network of people who have rights consciousness and can develop a set of practices that they can take to the next, maybe more challenging issue. So the nationalists in the former Soviet Union often organized around local environmental issues, which were a stepping stone in getting organized for the national self-determination effort. So those 4 were all kind of low challenge practical things that you can do. But we shouldn't forget the 5th thing, which is that you really should have a theory of change that's analyzed and discussed intensively for the people who are the vanguard of the human rights movement in the country. It's, as Rachel said, plans are nothing, but the other part of that is that planning is everything. And so thinking about your theory may never actually unfold the way you expect it to, but the fact that you've thought about like all the permutations and issues prepares you for the unexpected.
Great, thank you. Let's go to the panel now. Also on the questions, you're gonna have last word. Yeah. So Nate, you had a question to you about internal, external.
Yeah, and I'll try to speak as much as I can about where the momentum's going as I see it. I mean, I think, like I said, it's contradictory. I think that it's moving in both directions at the same time, and that's what makes this moment so interesting and strange. I mean, to take an example, and a very concrete, like practical example, part of what's happened in the last 8 months, since the dismantling of USAID and what's happened in the US, is that aid budgets are going down in Europe and elsewhere. And the reason they're going down is because defense spending is going up. And the reason defense spending is going up is because Europeans and Canadians and the British are going to have to make do at some point in the future, and they can't do it now, but they'll have to do it at some point without the United States in NATO. And that's insane, but they have to start now. if they don't start now, they should have, like a lot of people will say they should have started 10 years ago, but they have to start now. And defense is very expensive, and part of it is coming out of aid. And it's going to come out of other things too. It's going to come out of social services, things like that. I mean, this is like the giant political economy question, right? Everywhere else. One of several, but one of the biggest ones. There's also, I would say, the other contradictory element that's happening at the same time is that because of the crises of the last 10 years, particularly 2015 and onward, migration systems have hardened dramatically, very, very drastically, including in Europe. It is much, much harder to enter Europe in the way that it used to be. And that is producing a dramatic drop in migration numbers into Europe and into the UK. And that is the intended purpose of it. At the same time, it is not producing relief on the political side for pressure to decrease it even further, which is a very well understood phenomenon, which is that the harder you make these systems and the more effective they are, the more they reinforce the sense of fear that people have, because the border becomes an object that has to be protected and be impermeable. And the more any image that people can create of it being penetrated becomes like a source of vulnerability. It's this like ontological issue. And so there's this unquenchable thirst to basically create like an impermeable wall around these societies. At the same time, all of the elites in all of these societies know they have to have migration. They're not stupid. They can read the same magazines everybody else reads. They know they have to, like the demographics don't add up. They have to have people enter. And so there is also a contradictory impulse then to try to make better quality migration or more regular migration or whatever, which is far more expensive than doing it the other way. But so I would say that it's very much still in this flux period. I mean, I think that what's happened in the last year, 8 months, whatever, has been so traumatic and so chaotic. There's so many different elements to it. Those are only the top two I'd mentioned. I mean, I think the Chinese industrial shock that's happening in Europe is the other part of it that like is going to blow everything apart again. That they're moving very quickly, and I think that democracy is intended to be a committed part of it. And I think that there are real people who are genuinely serious about that. I don't think it's just words. I think they take it seriously and they mean it. And within that, though, then that's I think the question for human rights activists and others is how do you get into those rooms and make sure that there is meaning filled into that vessel, that when democracy is filled like with meaning, that it's a meaning that still contains human rights and that it still contains human rights for all of the people on that territory, at least, and perhaps even has an external element. And that's because it is open, right? It's basically being used as a signifier right now. And we have to find ways to not allow one side just to dominate or control what the definition of it or what that's.
For short on time, so I'm going to go to Tanya. Yeah.
So very quickly, absolutely, we need lawyers. Lawyers are the one profession that needs to be on the ground. You can't be an exiled lawyer as effective as you can be as an exiled journalist. So those are not equal. And we absolutely funding lawyers on the ground, critical. Their court cases are still being won, like critical. YLTU, we have tried the private-public partnership. You saw a case in Russia, every businessman who attempted to become a good guy was either imprisoned, declared foreign agent, etc. So I think in autocracy, this is why we see businesses even in the US just, preemptively comply because they don't see any possible positive outcomes for not complying. So that's unfortunately my not happy ending there.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Over to you.
Rachel.
A couple of things. So first, I can't emphasize enough how important lawyers are right now. They are the front line. They are on the front lines, and they deserve all of the support that donors and others can possibly give them for as long as they can hold out. And it's incredibly dangerous. And I just wanted to say that this is not just about people who are, now it's talking about Russia, but they're taking huge risks in other countries as well. But particularly Russia, they're taking huge risks with regard to all of the politically motivated cases that we know about and that we don't know about in Russia and also in occupied territories. And and the work that particularly the work that they do to defend Ukrainian civilians or Ukrainian POWs who have been basically charged with crimes because they because they fought in the war. That work is unbelievably dangerous. But it's essential, and there's a lot of work that's being done. And unfortunately, the stories of that heroism that these lawyers are doing can't be told publicly because they're taking such great risks. Also, I can't not say this, Jack. I know. You're absolutely. I thought all your points were very well taken. I just want to say one thing about building a coalition around the least provocative issue. Two things about that. One is I think you and I had this discussion like 10 years ago in this room. Yes, that's a powerful way to build a coalition. I don't know how you do that in an extremely closed society now, like in Russia now, or when the door is already shut. I mean, but I think it could. One thing that we didn't talk about is at what point will it be? At what point do we, sort of devote equal or more, resources on working on issues that aren't germane to repression? At what point do we start working on other issues that, even if we can't be part of a public movement, because for as long as this type of regime lasts, our documentation, our reporting might be used by someone somewhere. I mean, even in China, I think our Human Rights Watch's reports have moved policy decisions. But I'm not sure. Eventually, I think we'll need to move in. Human rights activists will need to start moving into those other areas again. But yes, on the least provocative issue, sure, that's how you build a coalition. Often our work is about protecting people who are the most marginalized, and whether it's in these autocracies, whether it's LGBT people who are extraordinarily marginalized and now becoming criminalized in Russia, in Turkey, in Azerbaijan and elsewhere, and they're just vilified. And if human rights organizations don't, and it's very controversial, and it's very, and the broader public, will probably find it very provocative, but it's just one of the things we can't not do. Except our debate about this was about a kind of a different issue. So I think we will always need to work on these issues that will be seen as provocative. And on private funding, I think you said everything about it, Tanya, already, but there used to, I think, the opportunities that existed before to get private actors involved. I mean, all of those loopholes obviously have been closed. You can't. It's just not feasible now in these closed societies. And I just we haven't really talked about that much about the impact, how impact the justice aspects of impact, and maybe that's sort of that is what we're after. That is what our main goal in many of the areas of work that we do, is to see justice done, if not in our grant periods, then certainly in beyond. And I think it's important for us to stay focused on not to lose sight of it, even though it's not immediately visible to us. I think it's an important motivator and goal.
Well said. So thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Hugh, and Human Rights Watch. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Pat. You'll certainly keep reading
so much, everyone,
about these and other topics.
Yeah,
and then you'll be quoting you. Remember you said it's going to get
remember you said, yeah. Want some tea?
No, I did.
I need it.
That is commitment.
Came all the way here.
No, I don't bring my own